So welcome to the Valid Performance platform. We're really fortunate to have a great practitioner with us today, Tim Parham, who is the rehab coordinator for the first team of Arsenal and is fortunate enough to also been working in the AFL industry previously. Tim, thanks for joining us. And if you could give everyone a bit of a rundown of where you've been prior to your current role and what you're doing at the moment, that would be great.
Thanks, Selwyn. Appreciate the opportunity to sort of come on board. I suppose at the moment I'm in London working at Arsenal Football Club in the role of rehab coordinator for the first team, sort of coming towards the back end of my second year here. Look, it's been a bit of a whirlwind the last 2 years, and then probably even more importantly, these last sort of 4 to 6 weeks have been definitely strange times. But a little bit of a background on myself. I've probably started out as most people do, at university, sports science, human movement graduate. Worked out pretty quickly that I didn't want to be a PE teacher. Fluffed around in gyms and strength and conditioning and those sort of circles for a little bit, and eventually landed on an undergrad career or study in physiotherapy, and was really lucky to be surrounded by some great people through that. And upon graduation, Scott Smith, who runs a really good sports clinic in Adelaide, had exposed me to a number of sports. Football at SNFL level, tennis with Tennis Australia, netball at pretty good level. So it was a real sort of melting pot of sort of sporting experience from there. And that spilled over into some work with the SNFL, which is working with some of the junior academies there. Obviously a sort of talent pathway into the AFL, and then actually worked for Adelaide Football Club as a bit of a jack of all trades. But I suppose the real sort of opportunity came when GWS, or Greater Western Sydney, came into the competition, and John Quinn approached me and gave me the opportunity to sort of work there and sort of start at the ground floor of an AFL team, which was incredible experience. So we sort of packed up and spent almost 4 years in Sydney, which in hindsight, looking back on it, was just a phenomenal experience in terms of starting from the ground up, and in hindsight looking at how sort of raw and inexperienced we all were, but we seemed to survive. And then I suppose on the back of that, I then sort of an opportunity sort of opened up at Port Adelaide, sort of in my home state, with Darren Burgess and Ian McEwen, Tim O'Leary, Stuart Graham, and it was a nice fit to move back home and sort of experience probably one extreme to the other, a very young football club, and then to go to a very old sort of well-established football club in the rehab space and working sort of across that rehab sort of platform. And then towards the end of 2018, Darren Burgess, who was already at Arsenal, sort of approached me to apply for a job there in a rehab role, and obviously it came at a very important time for the club, in that Arsene Wenger, who'd been there for 22 years and incredibly successful, and a real sort of patriarch and custodian of the club, his time had sort of come to an end. So it was probably an opportunity to go into that sort of position there, with the change that was sort of occurring before me, I suppose. So at the time, I was almost 18 months, and then it was started to be the sort of, well, why not, rather than why, and and here we are, sort of in lockdown in London. So into our 5th week.
Amazing journey. You've worked with some fantastic practitioners throughout that journey. John Quinn, one of the pioneers of our industry at GWS. So, a new club, new culture. Reflecting on that time there, and I guess a new organisation coming into the AFL, do you think that assisted you in then transitioning to Arsenal, who were possibly transitioning through another stage? It may, even though they've been under the one manager for a long period. Was there adjustments there that you felt that you'd learnt from GWS that benefited you through that process?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, probably the big thing in terms of the GWS experience in hindsight was we had an amazing sort of playing group, which were sort of, you know, precocious talent, you know, high draft picks, and a lot of them were all sort of thrust together from different states. I think Lockie Wilmot, who is obviously well known to you and your listeners, I think he may have been one of only a handful of Sydney-siders that actually worked for the team. And to that end, we were all sort of thrust together. We lived together for a period at Breakfast Point there, players included, staff. So it was a real sort of melting pot. And then I suppose one of the key things that, you know, it sort of taught me is, you know, at the end of the day, like, everyone just comes with a different skill set and different philosophy. And, you know, it's just probably more that ability just to roll with it. I think at Arsenal especially, I mean, I've given sort of talks, and I know fellow staff members have, that we're probably best represented by the United Nations flag. I think in our high performance department alone, we've got people from the US, Ireland, Japan, Russia, yeah, all over the UK, Australia, obviously. So we're a real melting pot of sort of practitioners and sort of backgrounds. So I suppose that's probably the common thread with that. And at the end of the day, I think we're all just there for the athletes. And if you know your core business is looking after the well-being of the athletes, that's probably a really good starting point.
Yeah, and so with working in like 3 different elite environments and elite sporting clubs, I know you've been working on some of your rehabilitation framework. How has that impacted your current philosophy? Because GWS, Port Adelaide, Arsenal, they're names that are highly regarded across the world in sporting organisations. What's that impact had on your framework you've been building?
Yeah, look, I suppose the framework probably points to my role a little bit, like, which is, you know, I sort of sit a little bit between the medical and a little bit the performance side. So it's more about probably trying to bridge that that gap and create. I suppose the one thing that has happened in time is we've had plenty of failures and things go pear-shaped, which I think in hindsight is probably a healthy thing. But I think probably one of the learning points is just, you know, the rehab process and the rehab structure, if you like, it is really, you want to avoid a conveyor belt approach, I suppose, and as much as possible, it needs to be the sum of all parts. You know, people working on the same page right from the word go. You know, from virtually the onset of injury, and I know it sort of gets bandied around and sort of gets lip service a little bit, but as much as possible, if everyone can just keep the ego at the door and play to our strengths, you know, within a high performance sort of medical department. So I think that's probably one of the big things is just avoiding that, you know, people working as silos and actually sort of collaborating early. And I think that sense of the sense of buy-in across a rehab package is really important for all staff.
And how do you go about getting buy-in from the other, I guess, stakeholders within your organisation? Because sometimes when athletes come into rehab, when you're the coordinator, it can be constantly you're giving the message and directing what needs to happen, but there's obviously other people, strength coaches or skill coaches and medical staff. How do you go about bringing those people in to help collaborate and then sell that one message?
Yeah, it's a tough one. I suppose it starts with the initial processes in terms of probably having that rigor within and that one message out. And I think having as many people buy into the process straight away and have a really good understanding of where it's headed and the scenarios that might unfold moving forward is probably a big part of that. The other thing as well, which I think is important, is in my view, it's really healthy for a an athlete to be passed from practitioner to practitioner through the rehab pathway. I don't think it's healthy to have an over-reliance on a sole practitioner throughout the journey. So in keeping with that, I think as long as your messaging is standard and you've put in that groundwork to get that messaging and those foundation sort of messages within your department, really tight, then I think it's a really healthy thing in terms of what goes out to then have the athlete be able to bounce from practitioner to practitioner, all the while knowing that the message is effectively the same. And I suppose that, we don't want to have an over servicing of the athletes. We want to create sort of robust athletes who will adapt and respond to different practitioners. And certainly one of my big objectives is to almost be a little bit hands off in some instances and actually let the painters paint, because there's guys who are a lot smarter than me with a lot better skill set in different areas, and who am I to then sort of go and put my message in over the top of that. So I think that fundamentally is what we're sort of striving for, but at the end of the day, that needs to be, you need to have a really good framework, and that also is the challenge, is to actually get all staff to work within that framework, and in keeping with that, you don't want to be so rigid that you lose the art and the craft of what we do. We obviously want to back things in by science and evidence-based practice, but at the end of the day, there is a million ways to skin the cat, and I think as long as within the department there's a clear recognition of a framework, and what leads to what, and what precedes and what then progresses from certain points in the rehab is really important. So a bit of a common language, if you like, I think is probably a big part of that.
Yeah, and you spoke about, I guess, the club and staff being like a UN, but also your playing group is going to be really diverse and plenty of different cultures and experiences as well. But then also on the flip side, you have some athletes that are probably of greater importance to the team, and so the number of games that they miss may, have an impact on your team dynamics. How does that impact on that decision-making communication process? Do you find that you need to adjust that messaging based on those factors?
Yeah, look, that if I was being a little bit reflective, I mean, that was one thing that I was not prepared for, was just the sort of diversity of the playing group and the ramifications or the challenges that probably presents. I think if you look at our current playing list at Arsenal, I think we've got 16 nationalities out of, I think, 25 first team players. And so coming from AFL, which is a wonderful sort of high performance environment in a sense that, Selwyn, with your experience, the players will do anything to play. They're pretty driven. They're pretty willing to do the work. But for the most part, I'm pretty sure if you walked into Melbourne Footy Club or North Melbourne or West Coast Eagles, there would be some differences, obviously, but the culture of rehab and performance would be very similar. So as part of that, I sort of walked into a Premier League environment, probably a bit naive to that, thinking that, being a bit bullish and thinking that my way was, the way. But what the sport brings is so much diversity. So you really do have to work with players, obviously, of different nationalities, but with that comes like a different expectation. And that's framed by their experiences, their previous coaches, previous physiotherapists, previous medical input. It also becomes, obviously, a big challenge when you're dealing with English as a second language, and that's something that I've really had to work with and around. So I mean, that's been probably one of the big sort of challenges, is actually just trying to modify your template and your plan around probably expectations and the diversity of expectation, I suppose.
Yeah, and with that, when you're meeting and I guess collaborating with the other guys in your performance team, how many times a week are you kind of reviewing and whether you've got to progress or regress an athlete as they're going through, say, a calf strain? How many times are they training versus when you're meeting and conversing about that?
Well, probably the first thing to touch on there as well is just the sheer chaos of a Premier League season and the schedule and the fixture congestion. We would look at probably playing 2 or 3 games a week, and with that, in terms of the high performance and medical side of things, you've got guys who are travelling, and often the travel, while it is great to be travelling with a Premier League team, you know, you're getting guys who are coming back at 2 or 3 in the morning and then fronting up to the club the next day because you're 2 days out from another game. So obviously a lot of your face-to-face sort of correspondence gets compromised to that end. In some way, shape or form, there's always a daily sort of summary of every rehab player and how they're tracking. And that takes many forms. Usually, if possible, if it's face-to-face, then that's obviously the sort of, you know, the number one. But yeah, generally it's WhatsApp groups and emails and almost, you know, just trying to make do with the logistics that present themselves. So we sort of put a heavy value on ongoing feedback. We have a daily medical meeting where we run through the list. And then on days when staff and players are traveling with the team, it's done sort of virtually, I suppose, by way of email, WhatsApp and those sorts of things. So there's a fairly sort of rigorous surveillance, I suppose, of the rehab guys across the group.
Yeah, great. And you spoke just before around, I guess, trying to provide the most evidence-based program, but in our industry, there's that kind of constant battle between evidence-based versus evidence-informed and coach's eye. Are you relying on yourself, or do you have someone else as an on-field pitch coordinator as well that you work aligned with to make those progressions mid-session? Because, you know, sometimes you can go out with that unconscious bias of, I just think this athlete's going to achieve, you know, this today, but they surprise you and you need to be able to be adaptive, but you may not, it may not follow your traditional framework. How does that work in your environment?
Yeah, definitely. So firstly, in terms of the on-pitch structure that we have at Arsenal, probably the first time I was ever like sort of starstruck at the club was when Robert Perez was sitting in the dressing room, and I sort of said to one of the guys, I said, well, what's he doing here? And he said, no, he's here to help with rehab. Far out. What a legend, absolute legend. So he's in his sort of, I think he's sort of late 40s at the moment, but comes out and helps with probably 90% of the rehab sessions, which first and foremost is brilliant, because you've got a club legend who's held in really high regard, you know, one of the Invincibles who comes out and literally passes and plays with the guys in terms of the rehab stuff. So that's been a massive win. And my touch, being Australian from Australian rules and having never played football, I think he said it's gone from appalling to just very, very bad. So for me, I don't quite cut it in drills. One of our big sort of on-pitch sort of drivers is our strength and conditioning, or one of our strength and conditioning coaches, Sam Wilson, who looks after a lot of the drill design. And he also is an accredited football coach. And he drives a lot of the technical and tactical sort of components to the on-pitch rehab. He's also supported by our strength and conditioning staff, namely Barry Solon as well, and Shad Forsyth, who is our sort of high performance manager, who'll chip in, and Tom Allen, who's our head of sports science. So between us, we muddle our way through. My role with the on-pitch stuff is more the GPS surveillance, feed some balls into drills where I don't technically have to play them back, and sort of monitor the session as it unfolds. In terms of having that flexibility, that's certainly one thing that the footballers at a Premier League club are really good at. If there's a ball and there's context to the drill design, they're fantastic. You can pretty much roll anything out, and as long as there's a ball, your uptake and your compliance is really good. Obviously, having someone like Robert means that the skills are really smooth and the drills run nice and smoothly. And if someone is really excelling within that session, then absolutely we'll talk about sort of progressing and then looking sort of forward in terms of how we modify their plan. But obviously those progressions and those sort of on the fly sort of modifications, they're more centered around, you know, collaborative discussion, you know, with the player, with obviously Sam, who's on the pitch, with the whole performance staff. It's never sort of a one person decision in terms of, you know, going it alone, which I think is really sort of comforting in a way. So yeah.
Yeah, definitely. I think that shared decision-making process between your high performance department and your athlete having input as well is valuable. And when you can lean on someone with exceptional talent, that makes everything a lot easier. We try and keep a few of our physios away from the rehab drills because they just complicate it with some of their rugby league kicking styles. But with the on-field progressions, how are you going about developing them with the S&Cs? Are they based off what the main team would be doing, or are they based off key kind of drills that you're wanting to tick off as part of the rehab phases?
Yeah, I suppose like most sort of professional organisations, we've developed a bit of a rehab drill planner, and that's probably just to give a bit of a framework and a bit of a backbone to the drills and what they spit out in a numbers sense. We have that sort of broken down as much as possible, sort of positional, and then to the individual if they've had experience with certain drills. In terms of the actual flow of that, they're obviously the sessions are planned through the planner to create a little bit of predictability and to mitigate the risk of sort of over or undershooting. And typically the sessions have different biases. I mean, one of the big contrasts to the AFL boys is, you know, these guys will probably be on pitch 5 out of 7 days a week. And it is fundamentally at the core to be out on pitch. You know, there's never any sort of questioning why they're doing consecutive days in a row. And often you want to progress a guy to sort of a 3-day lead into a game, which is effectively a 4 days on pitch. So with that, each session has a different sort of bias, if you like, be it sort of extensive, you know, you're chasing more bigger drills, more expansive drills, with more extensive metrics that sit beneath that by way of high speed and sprint. Then you have your more intensive days, which are more sort of your intensive metrics like estimated explosive distance or accel decel and some of those sort of intensive metrics. You obviously have a hybrid day where you sit somewhere in between for both. And then often, you know, one of the nice things about the Premier League in a way, and these guys is they'll train at different tempos, and you know, often the guys will just enjoy having just a technical day where it's ball only. You're not chasing anything physical, but again, they've got that skill component and that sort of context around what they're doing. In terms of the planning, as it sits at the moment, like Sam Wilson, as I've sort of said, he plans a lot of the drills and has a good drill sort of library. You'll very rarely get these players to run linearly, and even in the very early stages of rehab, you know, first or second session, they'll have a ball at their feet, albeit at some sort of modified intensity. But that's one of the key sort of things, and one of the things we want to try and push is get that skill element in, albeit at low intensity, very early. So, I mean, Sam has some drills, but we all have our own sort of go-to drills as well. But then the collaborative discussion in terms of what we roll out, you know, has to be sort of specific to the individual, has to be appropriate. It has to have some sort of tactical component to it by way of, you know, positional sort of movement pattern. And then just recently, obviously in December, we had a change in manager where Unai Emery left and Mikel Arteta came in. And that was a big change in terms of the club total. And he's obviously come from a very good system at Manchester City with a great coach, very systems-based coach. And, you know, one of the first things he did was he looked at some of the rehab drills and some of the subtleties around the rehab drills and has been pretty valuable in sort of making suggestions in terms of, you know, how to play the ball from one side of the mannequin to the other and those sorts of things. And just some of those things that he wants to sort of spill over into his game plan. So I suppose before all this sort of coronavirus stuff, we were sort of going down the path of trying to sort of explore his sort of game style and training style and getting a better feel for that, and then trying to layer that in through our sort of drill database and making changes that sort of sit with what the first team are doing.
And do you, when guys are starting to integrate back into training, do you have the luxury of popping them into a component of training and then bringing them out if you feel that they're able to complete, say, 20% of training, but there are other intensive drills that maybe they haven't ticked the right criteria to go into? Are you able to do that?
Yep. Look, Mikel has been a really refreshing change in that regard. He's been really open to having guys sort of drip feed in and out. There was a sense sort of with the previous management that once a player went in, that was it. You never saw him again. And equal to that, he often didn't know what the session content would look like. But whereas Mikel has been quite good at that, his emphasis is team and getting guys basically back in the flow as much as possible. And I think we're sort of developing that. Obviously with a new coach and taking over mid-season, it's been a whirlwind, I'm sure, for him, but it has been for us as well in terms of trying to learn his training patterns, learn what his sort of lead into games looks like, learn what his preference for his periodization across a typical week. So as much as possible, we try and sort of replicate that so that when players are called upon it kind of syncs with our rehab as well. I'm not going to say it's a perfect process by any stretch, but I'm yet to sort of meet anyone at a sort of sporting club or a football code where it is seamless. And there's a number of reasons for that, but it's certainly a work in progress, definitely.
When you talk about the periodization component, an interesting topic that often comes up is, I guess, tactical periodization, and it's probably something that in football has been a bigger proponent than say AFL more readily. So with your building of conditioning elements, I know you mentioned you're trying to get skill components as early as possible, but you may be trying to build volume through certain elements of conditioning. How are you going about addressing that through a week as you're building someone's loads?
Yeah, I mean, it's always challenging, incredibly challenging in terms of just trying to find that right balance, and then also trying to be aggressive. And you obviously want to you're trying to prepare the player to perform, not just return to train and play. So you want to get them in a good sort of physical shape, obviously. In terms of that sort of periodization stuff, I suppose the big thing, especially in terms of the soft tissue rehab, is just how we spread our high speed and sprint exposure, and how we map that out and plan that. That's probably a big component to it. One of the things I've been really amazed with is the durability of the guys on pitch, and it's been probably a steep learning curve for me personally in terms of stuff that I may have been in the past a bit reluctant to throw at an AFL footballer. These guys, they just roll out sort of most days and have a real good sort of on pitch durability. But for me, I mean, the big thing is being delicate with the top end speed exposure, and having reasonable recovery from that across the week. And then I suppose it's protecting and almost trying to sort of periodize into a return to play and a return to perform. And if you do have the luxury of being able to sort of consolidate a week here and there by way of time, then I'm a real sort of advocate for that, rather than having a real sort of, you know, step-like progression where the final step is to play. I'd almost rather get them there early, hold them for a little bit, and then push them that last little bit as they sort of lead in, just so that it's not, you know, that sort of tumbleweed approach by the time they return to play. I think that's a big factor in sort of mitigating risk of re-injury, especially in the soft tissue sense. So, and I think a lot of our sort of on-pitch rehab is geared that way. You know, chase your extensive metrics early, get that sort of that volume under your belt, maintain, and then probably be a bit more sort of delicate and a bit more discerning in terms of the peak speed or percentage thereof exposure as you move towards a return to play, and almost thinking it like a piggy bank. You know, you're sort of making deposits and just chipping away at it, and getting the guys to a really good position. The intensive metrics around the return to play sort of side, I think that the decels is obviously a massive component to football, and getting the sort of high magnitude deceleration volume. So that's something that's also given a fair bit of sort of credit. And as well as that, we use explosive distance as a metric. Obviously the sport, there's a lot of speed up, slow down running. So we try and layer that in as early as possible, just to reflect the demands of the game.
Yeah, I think that's a great point you mentioned in regards to trying to get athletes back to, I guess, their normal as early as possible, and have them at that as far away from when they're going to return to try and mitigate that subsequent or recurrent injury risk. So when you spoke about, I guess, some of your experiences with the structure of AFL and the structure of EPL, what would you change if you were to come back to AFL and have a soft tissue injury with what you've learnt now in regards to what the EPL guys are capable of doing on field? What would you kind of change with your approach to some of the AFL guys? Is it more early stage, mid stage, end stage that you think you'd modify?
That's a bit of a loaded question, but there's probably a few things. I think one of the real impressive things with these guys, as I sort of touched on earlier, is that ability to front up most days and be on pitch, and that's an expectation. I mean, I remember vividly, you know, some of our boys, you know, getting back from a European Europa League game, and you know, they got in at sort of 3 a.m. and then lo and behold, they're at the club at 9:30, and they're on pitch at 10:30. And no one's sort of complaining about being tired or, you know, a bit leg weary or any of that sort of stuff. And then these guys sort of pumping out a really, you know, aggressive session because they weren't playing the night before. So I think, you know, obviously there's differences in the sport, and I'm not discrediting the contact side of AFL. And I think it's a brutal sport. And, you know, you think about, especially in season, just what a week looks like, and you know, a lot of the guys are still sore on Tuesday, Wednesday after a Saturday game. So I'm not sort of discrediting that by any stretch, but one thing I think in the rehab space that I would probably look to possibly integrate is working more on sort of consecutive days, and rather than looking at hybrid sort of rehab sessions, which are a bit of everything, maybe being a bit cuter in terms of, you know, working consecutive days and having different focuses. I think as well, the tempo at which the guys train at, perhaps in AFL, is brilliant. Don't get me wrong. They're all guns blazing a lot of the time, and happy to really rip in and have a crack and do the work. But I think there's a lot to be said for even, you know, having guys out on the pitch or on the oval, doing lower intensity stuff, some skill-based stuff on those sort of down days, rather than keeping them off legs altogether. So I think that's probably been a big thing. I think I've also probably been a little bit more reflective on the strength and conditioning and gym-based side of the equation. I think a lot of the robustness of the footballers in the Premier League is due to, you know, the repeat days on legs, whereas I think the AFL boys get it more sort of in the gym. And I think if you could find a middle ground there, I think sometimes in terms of the S&C stuff, and certainly in rehab, I've been absolutely guilty of it, is maybe just cluttering programs too much and doing stuff because you've got the athlete that'll absolutely do it. So that one might be a thing. On the flip side, you've got a playing group in football who are probably moved more away from the gym than gravitate towards it, if you get my drift. So I think that's probably the big thing for me is maybe going back to an AFL would be maybe changing the frequency in terms of days on pitch or on the oval, and then also maybe decluttering some of the S&C stuff in the rehab space. That is, I think once the guys are back playing, I think for most clubs, and certainly my experience of that is that the load in terms of their strength load and what they're able to maintain given the game demands is really awesome.
Yeah, I think you make a great point on the consecutive day training. It's something we've integrated more so in early stage reconditioning phases with, say, quad and hamstring soft tissue injuries, is actually doing work 4 days in a row. And like you said, choosing what you're actually targeting quite specifically through those. So whether it's linear-based technical work or whether it's lateral-based movements, or whether it's just a purely technical, tactical component and maybe highly specific to the role they play within the team. But I think what we've found is actually, especially in the early stage parts of those soft tissues, not so much with calves because they're a little bit of a trickier, but with quads and hamstrings, by accumulating some volume over the 4 days, we actually find that then having a day off on what they can do on that next session, which is typically their biggest session, they feel significantly more confident in their body, and we may able actually to step up some of the intensive work because you've been a little bit more tactical with how you've drip fed other components in.
Yeah, I think that spot on. Yeah, I think that's a really, my experience, it sort of resonates with that as well. I think the other thing as well, just touching on it again, is at the end of the day, these guys are at this level, be it AFL or Premier League or whatever, and they've got here for a reason. And I think the big thing is, like, they're survivors physically, and they're good adapters. And that's one thing I think in my own sort of, guilty of it again, I think we probably think we have a bigger role to play than we actually do, and we probably inflate our sense of self-importance. I reckon that a lot of the AFL guys and the Premier League guys, they're there for a reason. They're robust for the most part. Obviously, there's exceptions, but they've survived because they're able to adapt to the environment. They're able to adapt quickly to the stimulus, and so I think we undersell that a little bit. And I probably subscribe to the Darren Burgess sort of model of you can always squeeze out more in that space. And I mean, you think about some of the upbringing of some of these players that I'm sort of working with at the moment, African from sort of extreme parts of the globe. They're not doing Nordics and, monitoring their eccentric load or coming through academies or any of that sort of stuff. They're playing every day, be it street ball, short-sided games, these sort of small-sided games, or 5-on-5 in the street, this sort of stuff. The legacy of that obviously has got them to a certain point, and I think we can be a bit too cute about some of the periodization stuff. And then the pleasing thing for me is you do see that sort of be vindicated a little bit by way of that exact model that you talked about, is just squeezing just that little bit more, and actually the guys benefit from moving. That's what they're built to do.
Yeah, 100%. And I think the complex nature and the chaotic nature of both of our sports also means that skill is king. And so for those guys who have played, multiple times a day and accrued multiple hours of training, that provides them a certain degree of resilience as well. And I think, we try and measure metrics and quantify performance by gym-based work, but what some research has told us is actually, if you can complete more training sessions in pre-season, you tend to be more resilient in season. So we put a lot of weight on what we can achieve in the gym and our strength to power ratio and force velocity profile. But a lot of what we're starting to see is actually if we can get guys training more frequently and training consistently, they tend to be more resilient, but also they probably tend to develop their skills quicker as well and cohesion as a team. So what's more important to us, our Nordboard numbers and force play numbers, or if we can improve our skill cohesion and actually improve our team dynamics? And it's probably something that for your group with new managers and game plans, that the more skill sessions you can get as a group, the quicker you're going to be able to develop into understanding that game plan.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So,
yeah, I mean, the new manager at the minute, it's all about, layering in his patterns of play and, his demands. And if that means being on the pitch or on a recovery day going and walking through a session, then yeah, absolutely. I think the end game is obviously performance and winning. That sort of keeps us in a job, I think.
Yeah, exactly right. And with your rehab philosophy, and I've spoken to you once prior to this, and I know you talk about rehab as an opportunity. With those longer term guys, what are you how are you assessing what it is that they require, either as a person or as a professional, and what you're trying to build out there?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a good sort of point. The rehab is an opportunity and should be looked as one. I suppose the big thing for me is that collaboration with the athlete themselves and getting a feel for what they feel they need as well. And I suppose that can vary in a physical sort of sense, whether it's they want to work on their first 5 meter acceleration patterns, or they want to look at body composition, or any of those sort of things. They want to perhaps put on some lean mass, or all of those sort of factors I think are really important. And the luxury of time in rehab is something you shouldn't probably take for granted, in the sense that with everything going to plan, these guys will return, and you might not sort of have that luxury of time in a professional sporting sense. And I sort of always said I've got a guy at the moment who is sort of 4 months into an ACL, and one of my big sayings is it's an absolute disservice if you don't come out of an ACL, for example, physically better than you go in. And that might be working on sort of past medical history or any of those sort of things that, biomechanical deficits, anything really of that nature. I also think it's important to sort of think holistically. I know, whether the player sort of has, or the athlete has ideas about, coaching or life after football, of either code, or whether it's, they want to sort of delve into, off-field pursuits, be it, by way of education or some work experience or that sort of stuff. I think that's really important in terms of rounding out the whole sort of rehab package, because at the end of the day, like, for the grind that rehab is and should be, I think to come out the other side in better shape holistically is a massive win for everyone. I think the player obviously first and foremost, but I think it gives you a real sense of job satisfaction in a way when you see a guy who's worked on stuff that they want to work on, and you feel like you've been part of that collaboration. So I mean, that's a big thing for me. And I think as well, like, as part of that, I think we're very lucky at Arsenal. We work in a very resource-rich environment, and I think a lot of the times when the players are in the cut and thrust of seasons and training and week in, week out, playing multiple games a week, they lose a little bit of sight of the bigger picture within the club. And I think as well as that, I think in rehab, it's a great opportunity sort of to direct the athlete services, be it psych, be it coaching development, all those sort of more subtle sort of services or auxiliary services around that sort of wrap around the high performance and medical program. So that's a big thing for me, and certainly it's something I've been sort of investing more sort of time and energy into, because I think that really helps sort of empower the athlete at the end of the day.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. That empowerment of the athlete is really pivotal cornerstone for, I think, all successful rehabilitation programs. With you talked about the return to perform component. You obviously, every injury is kind of contextual, but when you're looking at your end stage integration and guys going back into play games, what does your workflow look like there in regards to integration into skill training with the team, and then reintegration into game time? If they're a guy who typically plays 80% game time, or so forth, how do you plan that out for that last stage?
Yeah, that's a good question, and probably it's a non-linear. There's probably a non-linear sort of answer to it. I think the first thing is, certainly in football, is working out what the manager wants. At the end of the day, he's the custodian of the club, and his sort of success is is very results dependent. So learning a little bit about what his optimal lead-in looks like, by way of the training in the preceding days to game day. I think it's really important to get a feel for that. So working back from there, what we try and do is, obviously, we layer in as much sort of end stage chaos. And you may have seen some papers, Tom Allen and Matt Taberner did a Control to Chaos paper, which effectively is what most rehabs are. So we try and layer in as much chaos and spontaneity within the drills in a tactical sense. Towards that end stage, you layer in sort of worst case scenario drills, which is chasing a combination of metrics and exposure in a performance sense. But as part of that, we've also lent on, again, super lucky. We have an academy that trains on site, under 18s, under 23s. Again, precociously talented sort of individuals, and we put a real load behind actually getting that training integration with bodies around the player in rehab as early as possible. And one of the sort of ongoing sort of feedback that we've had from a lot of the longer term rehab guys is that just having that that foot traffic and having the sort of the chaos of having players around them, albeit in a non-threatening environment, is actually really good in terms of just layering in some cognitive demand. So I suppose it's a horses for courses, and it's an individual sort of planning approach. But the big thing is working out, okay, what can we do to bring in that element of chaos? Is the player safe? Have we mitigated as much risk and effectively overexpose them as much as possible in the rehab sense? And then we work out ways of then sort of layering in, other players, be it, starting with, possession or a small-sided game, working as a neutral in a drill, and then progressing there by way of what the first team sort of schedule looks like and their training content. So that's where it gets tricky, because obviously you've got a lot of buy-in from a lot of different stakeholders, and logistically it's also tough. But certainly we put great value in having just that, players around the athlete has been hugely important. So
yeah, well, it sounds like the collaborative nature and culture of your organisation allows that conversation to be a little bit easier to have towards the back end. But when in regards to metrics that you may be using more in the kind of strength, and we spoke about the gym setting, you spoke previously about some on-field stuff in regards to D-cells and explosive acceleration being important. Are you putting much weight on assessments within your gym program as well?
Yeah, definitely. I think that's probably underpins a lot of the on-pitch stuff, is having that confidence in the sort of the strength exposure and the resilience that sits within that. Obviously, we have our objective metrics. Nordboard, we use IKD a lot, which seems to be a big sort of football thing, which again I've sort of had to wrap my head around really quickly. But that's a nice way of sort of isolating and targeting a muscle group at different velocities and in different ranges, and you can be quite specific about that. So that underpins a lot of it. We do use obviously our standard testing by way of our reactive strength testing and so forth. But I think a big part, and sort of touching on what I spoke about earlier, is when you have a bit of a general or common framework and a bit of an understanding of what, say, a hamstring rehab, for example, looks like along a continuum from early stage to end stage. I think a lot of the outcome measurement, if you like, comes from what the player has been exposed to. So if the player has been readily exposed to, good eccentric strength volume, and then has progressed really into a power ballistic sort of phase, then that in itself is almost an objective measure, if you get my drift. So I think if we have that framework and we understand that the player has moved through the gears and has moved towards the end stage, then that becomes almost equally as important as your Nordboard assessment, your IKD assessment, and your sort of jump data, I suppose. So yeah, I mean, we wouldn't lean on any one thing, but that's probably the core sort of objective strength markers that we would sort of lean on.
Yeah, I think injury is multifactorial, and the approach that you have to make to identifying whether someone's ready to perform is multifactorial as well. And you summarised it really well, but there's not one metric that's ever going to guarantee a player's going to return safely or get re-injured. And so it's trying to build your profile out and remove as much bias as you can, and build as much confidence in your own department, but in the athlete as well. It's mate, it's been a really great conversation today. I really want to appreciate you giving us your time. I know it's early morning there for you in London, and you've been in lockdown and got your two young children who are probably waiting for dad to get frozen on the TV again or something along those lines. But really appreciate
today's tangled today. I think it's
yeah.
I think I was saying to you before that the Disney Channel has copped a fair bash over the last sort of 5 weeks. So yeah, but that's all good. Sort of brushing up on the Shrek and Lion King.
Yeah, lovely. Don't worry, I'm doing plenty of the same. But really appreciate your time. Do you have if anyone has any follow-up questions for you, or anything you wanted to share with the audience before we sign off?
Not particularly. I mean, if anyone wants to sort of sing out, and I'm sort of more than comfortable to chat to anyone about anything. So I think you've got my sort of Twitter handle there. I'm happy to receive inbox messages there or private messages. So but yeah, more than happy to chat.
Yeah, perfect. Well, the climate at the moment allows for a little bit more conversation with different practitioners around the globe. So yeah, if you've got any further questions for Tim, he's been involved in some phenomenal organisations and worked with some great practitioners who I have no doubt he's helped develop and also have developed himself. So thanks again, Tim, for your time, and enjoy the rest of your day.
No worries. Thanks, Selwyn. Appreciate the opportunity, and yeah, hopefully we can sort of come out of this coronavirus stuff sooner rather than later, get back to some normality and get back to doing what we love.